Yeah, cool. All right, so we want to talk about two things today. We want to talk about religion and faith a little bit up front, and then we want to talk about justice and liberation. So, Chris, as you mentioned, we talk a lot about politics, but we think it's really important to flesh out like really what we mean by religion and what we mean by being persons of faith, because there's lots of different kinds of ways of understanding and thinking about that, and we find us both having conversations both with like religious people and then also like comrades who are not religious. And so it's an interesting conversation, I think, that is being had. And there's no one way, perhaps, to really respond to it, but I think you and I have a unique way. So, I mean, what are we talking about when we talk about religion?
Yeah, absolutely. First, we have to acknowledge, I think, that most communists are not religious. And there are some good reasons for that, and there are some very poor reasons for that, I think. Not that if you're listening to this and you're not a religious person, but you are a communist, I'm not saying you should be religious.
No way.
I'm saying, yeah, I'm saying that some of the reasons why communists give for why religion is a waste of time
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
or silly don't actually hold good. So when we say religion, I've heard you talk about this so many times. When you talk about religion, you're really talking about stories that ground us and propel us and give us meaning. Do you want to say any more about that?
Yeah. I mean, let's start. It's kind of easiest for me to start with what it's not. Let's start with religion is not a science. Religion is not religious truth, theological truth. When I'm talking about Jesus or God or faith or grace or sin, I'm not speaking scientifically. And just to give an example of that, like God to me is not some thing with a penis out somewhere up in the sky. You know what I'm saying? God is not a material thing, an object that influences and influenced by other things scientifically. I think that's a big thing, a big difference between kind of speaking scientifically of God or speaking theologically of God. One emphasizes the symbolic meaning behind it that I think should orient our actual material ways of being in the world. And then the other is obsessed with like this enlightenment struggle for scientific truth. Like I think a lot of reactionary and right-wing religion has been or has attempted to be scientific. Right? The earth was created literally, scientifically in 7 days. Or maybe a more liberal interpretation would say, well, maybe it wasn't 7 days, maybe it was 4.5 billion years, right? But God was the one who was like causing certain things, like humanity was just guaranteed, it was destined to happen. Or some people might even say, well, no, I believe in the Big Bang, right? The universe is, what is it, like 7, 8 billion, no, 4, no, I can't remember how many
It's
billion.
old.
Yeah, it's super old. And so some people are like, well, there's this mysterious unknown behind it, and now that's God. And so there's actually been this historical tradition of religious people doing that. Religion to me is not the explanation of the unknown. I'll say that.
Yeah, so we're not thinking metaphysically. We're not sacrificing our materialist commitment, our materialist way of thinking to be religious. The religion helps orient us and ground us. Christianity does not have a political program. It does not have a way to get from the society we're in now to the exact society of God's dreams, right? We think Maoism is actually the science that can help us get closer to that. But Christianity, what it does for me, I should say, is that it gives me a fiery spirit. It gives me a commitment to the poor, marginalized, forgotten, the people of God. It makes me think a little bit more clearly in some ways about systems and structures that destroy God's people. It gives me a love for creation. We call it creation. That's a tricky word. You got to tease out what we mean by creation.
Yeah, it's
But
like that. That's not like a scientific term, right?
God didn't like form the tree outside my house like out of clay or something.
Yeah, awesome. No, that's a good point. And It's interesting that you say that religion for you compels you in one political direction, because we know that religion can and often has. I'm thinking the religion in the United States, right? It's actually compelling people in a bad political direction. So what really about religion, Chris, makes it so like fluid?
Hmm. I would say religion has a class character. Like any art, any song, any poem has a class character. I would say religion is the same way. So we can see multimillionaire preachers on TV talking about religion in a particular way, and other Christians deeply committed to a different vision of Christianity than they are.
Yeah, I mean, as we've talked about before, religion is really a part of what we call the superstructure, right? There's an economic base, and then on top of that is the superstructure, the cultural, political, organization, and mode of thinkings that occur within a society.
Yeah, on that note, there are lots of situations in the history of our planet that you can point to that are travesties, particularly because of the way Christianity was used, or at least that's one of the reasons why. I mean, like the Crusades, forced sterilization, manifest destiny. The list goes on and on of things done by Christian people for quote unquote Christian reasons. So this is another thing, Chase, I've heard you say time and time again. Christianity has never been one thing. Yeah,
Yeah,
that sticks with me. I think about that a lot.
Christianity, like all things, is inherently contradictory, right? There's contradictions within Christianity, and it's pluralistic. And I think Christianity or any kind of religion can be captured by political forces, by class forces, by other kinds of social and cultural manifestations. And as you're naming right now, unfortunately, a lot of Christianity historically, ever since like the 5th century, has been captured by the dominating, exploiting classes. First of the feudal lords and princes, and a lot of the Christianity was kind of passed down to the serfs to reproduce in their subordination and exploitation. And then under capitalism, Christianity has often been seized by the bourgeoisie and by imperialists and by colonizers to help reproduce their class power. So that's an interesting thing about religion, right? It's not unique to Christianity, but religion itself is not actually based on scientific assessment of anything in the world. Lost my train of thought here.
That's all right. I'll jump in.
Yeah.
So there's this understanding amongst some communists that once society reaches the right level or the right stage of the revolution of socialism or finally of communism, religion will just fizzle out. It'll die off.
Wither
It's
away.
it's unnecessary. It's a burden on humanity. It gets in the way of human flourishing and relationship. There are some Christianities that I want to die. I want them to die.
Yeah.
And yet, the way we're talking about religion is not something that's going to pass away whenever we reach a certain level of society. We're always going to have stories that ground us in meaning, even though we're not interested in talking about Adam and Eve as historical figures or interested in whether Jesus walked through the walls in the resurrection story or not. That kind of stuff is not the interesting part of religion for us. Religion is always going to be with us in some form or fashion. It is a site of struggle. It's not part of the base, right? It's not who controls the means of production, who owns the shit, who profits from production. But it is a site of struggle that's always going to be with us, in my estimation, at least.
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. I've thought about this a lot this past year as to whether religion will wither away. And Marx and Engels were very explicit that they genuinely did believe that religion solely existed because of class society. But I don't think that's the case. I just think that religion is beholden to class society. I don't know what religion and spirituality will be like in a world of communism, but unless it's like supernatural stuff, I don't see why, say, religious practice, communal practice, religious story will be withered away. It's not like we're just going to transition to communism and then we're not going to have poems anymore. You know what I'm saying? We're not going to have song. We won't have symbols. Like that's like the end of language. I think we can be materialists, dialectical materialists, and religious people, and our philosophy doesn't have to be in contention with our religious like orientation. And to me, one of the last things we should talk about is like, what does it mean to be a person of faith? To me, my religious like practice, my religious orientation, the religious community in which I am, and that's both like our languages, our the songs we sing, the conversations that we have around these stories and our historical tradition. This should orient us, in my opinion, towards the material world. So we're kind of up here in our heads, and we're talking and we're thinking, we're stopping for a moment, pausing within the day, making a reflection, and that should bring us back to the material lived realities, our living relations. And that's why we need like things like social sciences or revolutionary science, especially to really understand, well, what is like, how are we in relationship together? How am I actually related to the person on the other side of the planet, the tree that I will never see in another part of the world? How are we in relation, and are these relationships good or bad? Right? Because that's when my faith is pretty obvious, I guess, in my mind. That's when my faith comes in and says, well, if it's bad, you got to change it. You can't just continue to live in wrong, violent, harmful relations. That to me is the outcome of the Christian story for me, or at least one of it. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. So I tried to say this earlier and I couldn't find the word. Christianity can orient us, but it doesn't have a political program. It does not have a X, Y, and Z to make the world the best place it could possibly be. And another thing you named was that Christianity has been seized by forces of power, by capital, by colonizers, by imperialists. And if Christianity can be seized by those forces, we think that there can also be a Christianity of the socialist, of the communist variety,
Mm-hmm.
and lots of different kinds that emerge out of particular instances and places where people struggle. One example of that is the really good episode you did with the scholar from the Philippines.
Mm-hmm. Victor Aguilan.
Victor Aguilan, yes, that was a great episode.
Yeah.
2 episodes, I believe, yeah?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Christianity can clearly be a tool in the hands of the poor, the proletariat, the dominated, just as it can in the hands of, the capitalist, imperialist, colonizer.
That's a great point, right? So while religion tends to be dominated and consumed and enclosed upon by the ruling, exploiting, and oppressing class, and under capitalism, that's the bourgeoisie, it can also, we think, become a tool, a weapon, a source of energy and initiative and creativity and just revolutionary, just commitment and fire for the proletariat, for oppressed nations, right? If they are religious. And so, yeah, I think that's a great point that you made, because religion is often bourgeois, right? It's often colonial, it is often patriarchal and imperialist, but it can be the opposite. And yeah, that's really important for us, both as Christians or religious people, and for non-religious comrades, I think, to really grasp.
And the last thing I want to say on this particular question is that even if Christianity or faith in general just isn't interesting to you, I think it's important to realize that most of the people in the United States, I don't know where you're listening from, most of the people in the West may not be actively involved in a church or a synagogue or a mosque or what have you, but they do think of themselves as religious, and they would often name themselves as Christian. So as it is part of the superstructure, it's important to understand the things that are down deep in the way people think about things, and the ways they don't respond necessarily just the way you might expect from their class background or their particular situation in the world, but has to do with deep things in the superstructure that we need to be able to name and account for.
Well, cool. Let's do a little bit of theology. We talked a little bit about religion and faith right now. And I think something that is interesting, especially when I was going through seminary, was this relation between justice and liberation. And I remember actually having a short conversation with a professor about this, but I don't think it's clicked as much until recently, actually, just with my political analysis of the relationship between reform and revolution. I did this bonus episode on Luxemburg's text, and I think there's an interesting parallel. Let's talk about justice and liberation. So, Chris, why don't you start us off? How do you see the relationship between the two? And before you go, last thing I'll say is a lot of Christians, a lot of listeners have been committed to doing justice work, right? Justice is very important for us all. We are for justice work, and we need to realize justice. But liberation usually gets a back burner, or maybe it's usually conflated. They're like the same thing. So do you think the same thing? Do you think they're the same thing, or are they different? How are they related?
So I come from one of those traditions that really prides itself on being a social justice church. So we talk a lot about justice, social justice, biblical justice. And I don't see a problem with that necessarily. Throughout the scriptures, the authors of the Bible talk about justice over and over again. It's a central core theme. So whenever I think of justice, I think of a world that has gone through communist revolution. Not that revolution would solve all the problems of humanity, but it is a prerequisite to thinking about how we actually take racism seriously. There are problems that we can't answer adequately in the present, right? Under capitalist relations, whenever the boss has all the power in the workplace, whenever ideologies of racism, xenophobia, so on and so forth have this role of separating people from struggle for their lives. So justice to me is something that can be sought during and after the struggle for liberation. So whenever we think about liberation, which is different, we might think about colonized nations in the United States, the Black colony, our Chicano brothers and sisters and comrades, largely immigrant communities, indigenous folks, all of these particular nations that, unless they can get the boot of the United States of America off of their neck, there's no such thing called justice. There's no way they can form just relationships internally and justice be achieved. Because God's justice, at least, has to do with right relationship of the whole. It's about wholeness. It's about all things relating together correctly, rightly, properly. And under the current orders of the world, that's not something that we can have. So liberation comes before justice.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, right? Liberation before justice. So I think I would say that any kind of justice, if there is such a thing on this side of liberation, is deeply partial and incomplete, and that a fuller justice, a fuller reconciliation is only possible after liberation. And I think justice could really flourish and thrive and spread, but we are so confined on this side of liberation. So I think liberation has to come first before justice can really start to flourish.
I think that's a good point. So whenever we think about, let's say, relationships with a partner or a beloved person in our individual lives, a person we love, it is more just to think about how we can relate to this person better. But ultimately, true justice in our communities and even with the people we love, the direct relationships with the people we love, those can be made better through liberation, through getting the boot of capital off our neck, getting capital's way of predetermining our relationships out of the way so that we can flourish and really consider, really think about what it means to have just relationships, right relationships.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a really helpful way of talking about it, right? Not just political transformation, liberation, but let's talk about interpersonal for a second. So if there is a unequal and oppressive relationship between two friends, between two people who are so-called lovers, between two people, right? If there's an oppressive or violent ways of relating to one another are being established, and harm is done from one direction to the other, in order for those wrongs to be made right, in order for the harm to actually be addressed, for reconciliation to truly be had, there has to be a transformation of the ways of relating to one another. You can't continue that oppressive, that unjust, the harmful ways of relating to one another and hope for reconciliation, right? It has to be a fundamental transformation. And that's why I think, say, forgiveness or a true healing, or call it justice, can only be had after there's a fundamental addressing of the root causes of why that oppressive relationship is being had, right? Why that one person is harming the other person.
Yeah, and of course it's still important to think about forgiveness and love and tenderness and all the things that make our immediate relationships good and beneficial and beautiful. But we will never forgive our way into a new world. It's not going to happen. So there are some folks who think that we can, by just thinking about our immediate relationships and how we relate together, how we share things, that can get us to a new world. And I think we have to reject that. And we have to reject it also when churches do it. When churches want to talk about justice, social justice, justice for the LGBTQIA plus community, justice for Black and brown folks, justice for immigrants, a kind of justice that doesn't actually take seriously the material conditions that we find ourselves in, the ways in which we relate. Now, churches, of course, do this all the time. And why do they do it? Well, one reason is because it's hard to get people to give money to a church that is telling them that the ways they relate to one another are fundamentally broken. That if they are landlords, they need to stop being landlords. If they are bosses, they need to stop it.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? There's an idealist form of justice. There's an idealist form of Jubilee. In our recent conversation with Kateri from Jesus Magazine, we talked about Jubilee. And Jubilee, I mean, I wonder how many times it's sung, talked about in churches all across the United States. But the connection between actual decolonization, not decolonization of us individually or decolonization of culture, without actual land back, but I think it's important to really think about Jubilee materially, and historically, or justice materially and historically, rather than an idealist hope that actually doesn't realize any form of justice. And another thing you said, Chris, or made me think about how justice work can't lead us to liberation. Justice work, I think, has to be done for the purposes of liberation, so that justice can be realized on the other side of liberation. But I think if we believe that the slow, incremental justice work, we're not progressing towards this liberative transformation. I think justice work that we do, and we should do, has to lead to the necessity of liberative fundamental break with this order.
Yeah, and that doesn't exclude really good relationships with your friends and family and people you live with. You should share things. You should help each other get through. We're just saying that that's not going to make a new kind of world emerge out of the old one. That's a dead end to us.
Justice is always partial, deeply incomplete on this side of liberation. And so if we want to have a fuller, more realized world of justice, and really realize justice for workers, for Black people, for Indigenous people, for LGBTQI people, for women here in the real, actual world, then we have to achieve liberation first. And we would say national and class liberation, so that we can implement and so that we actually have the power to realize actual justice. So reconciliation, let's throw it out until after liberation. We can't have reconciliation. We can't have a mending of relationships on this side of the violence. We have to get on the other side of liberation, my friends.
Yeah, power is the key word in
Yep.
revolution. Power.
Yep.
$15 an hour will not bring about justice. $16 an hour will not bring about justice. There is no campaign for better pay or better conditions under capitalism that will bring about justice.
Yeah.
We have to understand that.
Yeah, free healthcare in the imperial core will not bring about justice throughout the world for literally billions and billions and billions of human beings. We can make it really cozy for us here in the US at the expense of the rest of the world, which is what an imperial power does. That's an imperialist relationship. So yeah, Chris, it's been cool. I think this has been really fun. I think we're starting to dive into basically like what it means to be a Christian for us, and also in light of the actual material relations that we live in within the world.
I'm glad to be a part of Faith and Capital going forward. And hey, really check out those bonus episodes. They're really good. Chase is not going to toot his own horn, but they're really good.
They're definitely, hopefully they help listeners gain a nice basic intro to the first revolutionary stage of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, which is Marxism.
Yeah, more to come.
Yeah.
Lots more episodes coming.
Cool. All right, Chris. Any final words? Super glad to have you on the show. It's gonna be a really fun year.
Yeah, if you have any thoughts on the whole Santa and elves debacle that we named at the top of the show, please leave them in a comment, or give us an answer online or something, because we're really trying to figure out how we can assist in the liberation of the elves.
Absolutely. Yeah. I got nothing after that, so.
All right, happy holidays, y'all.